Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Cohen. I am the director of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. I also teach in the philosophy department here at Georgia State University. Before I hand off the introductions to Gabby, just wanted to put in a brief plug for some events that are coming up that are sponsored by the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. Next Tuesday, March 31st, from 2:15 until 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time, we have Professor Predrag Chigovaki, who will be speaking on the meaning of life. That is a free virtual presentation. And on Monday, April 1st, from 3 o'clock until 4:15 p.m., again, Eastern Time, Professor Elizabeth Brake from Rice University, the philosophy department there, will be talking about the wrong of stalking, a feminist approach. I'm delighted to now hand off the introductory duties to Gabby Zhang. Gabby is the leader of the student chapter of Phi Sigma Tau Zeta Georgia, for which I am proud to serve as the advisor. Gabby.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Gabby. So today I'll be hosting this event with Sabrina. And we're very pleased to have Dr. José Mendoza to visit us today. And the talk for today is very relevant and much needed for our society, especially given what happened on March 16th. So a Caucasian man shot 8 people dead, and 6 of them were Asian women. And I think this atrocity is indicative of many issues in our society that we, as its members, whose motivations, beliefs, desires shaped by the society cannot ignore. So I think today's talk is going to unveil some key components behind these issues. But before we start, please allow me to give a short introduction to Dr. Mendoza. So Dr. Mendoza is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Washington, is a co-editor of Radical Philosophy Review. His primary areas of interest are in moral and political philosophy, philosophy of race, and Latin American philosophy. His current research deals with topics concerning migration ethics, Latinx identity, and racial justice. So Jose is also the author of The Moral and Political Philosophy of Immigration, Liberty, Security, and Equality, which is focused on making a philosophical case for immigrant rights and arguing against unjust forms of immigration enforcement. His articles have appeared in journals such as the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, Public Affairs Quarterly, Critical Philosophy of Race, and Philosophy in the Contemporary World. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Jose Mendoza, and Jose, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I will thank the Ethics Center, Georgia State University Philosophy Department, Gabby and Sabrina and Andrew for hosting me and inviting me. So let me just go ahead and get started here. This is part of a larger project that I'm doing. So there's going to be parts of this paper that I'm going to kind of skip over, and a lot of this, I mean, most of it was written prior to the shooting that happened there in Atlanta. So one of the interesting things maybe for Q&A is how well or how badly this paper holds up in the light of that. I think one thing I've noticed that has to be talked about more is going to be issues of misogyny. Originally, this paper, as you'll see, was trying to look at pan-racial groups and how to respond to the kind of discrimination they face in places like the United States. So a few years ago, what the launching point for this paper in particular was a few years ago. Then President Donald Trump lashed out at 4 congresswomen of color who collectively are known as the Squad. These congresswomen include Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley. And in attacking these women, Trump deployed a kind of standard xenophobic trope. He, in essence, told them to go back where they came from. What most of these commentators quickly picked up on Trump's comments was that the 3 of these congresswomen were born inside the territory of the United States. And the only foreign-born member of the Squad, Ilhan Omar, came to the US at the age of 8 as a refugee. And so there was really I forgot to set my timer, nowhere for her to go back to necessarily. In response, what one of these congressmen did, Don Beyer, he kind of put a response tweet. And he tweets this collage of pictures featuring himself, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, with the statement, only one of the members of Congress pictured below was born outside of the United States. Right? So what Beyer's response tweet was trying to make clear was that Trump's comments were not so much targeting these members of Congress for being born outside of the US, which would have made Trump's comments sort of standardly xenophobic, but that Trump's comments were targeting these members of Congress for being non-white. And as I mentioned before, I think there is also a strong element of misogyny here too, which needs to be foregrounded more in this work of mine than it currently is. If the point that folks like Beyer are making is correct, then merely calling Trump's tweet xenophobic, which is traditionally how this remarks of the kind go back where you came from are categorized, those things seem to be missing something very important. The inadequacy that some of us, although perhaps not all of us, but a lot of us feel in calling such comments, just calling them xenophobic, simpliciter, stems from two things, I believe. One is that it misses something important about what these sorts of comments are doing or what they're getting at. And the second thing is they don't seem to generate the kind of moral censure that many of us feel such comments deserve. So for these reasons, many have come to understand or have simply gone ahead and called these sorts of comments racist. The advantage of calling these comments racist is that the racist label captures what many of us feel gets left out or gets overlooked by merely calling them xenophobic. So for example, the fact that Beyer is likely to not be the target of such comments, even though he's born outside of the US, right? So it misses the white supremacy aspect of it when we don't call him xenophobic is the worry. And also the racist label brings with it a very high level of moral censure that many of us believe these sorts of remarks deserve, right? There are others, however, who also, so this is what's key about the talk. So in some sense, it's kind of an inter-camp talk, right? So some folks share concerns 1 and 2 that I just raised. So very importantly, these are folks who are critics, not defenders of Donald Trump's comments. But they nonetheless feel that deploying the racist label in these sorts of cases risks overextending the meaning of the term race. And the danger of overextending a term like racism is that if too many forms of hostility, oppression, or discrimination get labeled racist, we begin to water down the term, starts to lose its kind of moral force. And in places like the US, there are probably good reasons to want to hold on to the specificity of a term like racism, a term that demarcates the hostility, discrimination, oppression faced by African, Asian, and Native American descended peoples. There's also a second worry that some of these folks have, which is that if racism is the primary fault with comments like those made by Trump, it might be easier to both kind of avoid the moral censure in the future. So maybe you dress up the comments a little bit better, you exclude natural born citizens or include folks like Beyer. So even though these comments seem to avoid the racist label, they still deserve moral censure. So let me put this in a different way. The idea here would be that we only think of these comments as wrong if they are racist when we apply the race label. We could say, you had us at xenophobia. It's kind of what this is saying, right? So the moment you went xenophobic, that was already bad. The fact that it might also be racist just adds further badness to it. But part of the worry is that if you say it's not bad until it gets racist, right? We might be missing some of the moral harms, and we can dress them up in certain ways to avoid criticism. So I actually think that what most of us believe is something like the correct position is going to fall somewhere between these two positions I've just laid out for you. But this is kind of a very elusive Goldilocks position, right? One that's going to cohere with our intuitions about what sorts of remarks are being used in the service of white supremacy and meriting a high degree of moral censure. But at the same time, we want to be able to talk about these things, in a way that doesn't require us to overly expand our concept of racism such that the label of such that the label racist begins to lose its coherence, and not to mention its importance in contextualized historical meaning. So with this as its overall aim, my paper is going to try to advance 3 claims. The first is that we ought to constrain the scope of racism, but do so not necessarily by narrowing our concept of racism. So the scope of racism, we're going to narrow it, but not by narrowing the concept of racism, which is what some philosophers have suggested we do, but by maintaining a more delimited concept of race. So I will come back to these things, but it's kind of confused, right? So the concept of race, right? We don't have to narrow that, or sorry, the concept of racism. It's the concept of race that I'm going to delimit the scope of racism. The second thing I'm going to try to convince you of is that I think we need to do a better job of employing 3. It's actually 2 terms, but I want to talk about them as 3. The terms of racialization, racial formation, and racial disaggregation. And the final aim, if I do a good enough job in 1 and 2, is that I'm going to try to start making the case that we ought to think of the difference between racism and xenophobia. We should think of it as a difference of kind, not a degree. The difference shouldn't be about how much moral censure we think something deserves. It's that these are different kinds of forms of discrimination and hostility, and we should see them as different, and we should begin to see xenophobia as something as bad as racism, or close to as bad on its own. So let me start with the first section here, and that's on racism, whether we should think of it in the wide or narrow scope. So there's a lot of debate in literature as to whether or not all racial wrongs, regardless of their severity, should be condemned as racist. The one dominant view on one end is Larry Blum's. This comes from his book, the title of which is "I'm Not a Racist, But," 3 dots. It's been very influential. It's almost 20 years old. It's kind of a standard in philosophy of race. And there he says, no, we should reserve racism only for the most serious racial failings. Because again, looking back at some of the concerns we had earlier, it begins to be overused, it begins to lose its force, but also what Blum is interested in is in actually dealing with racial wrongs. And he thinks, look, what happens sometimes is someone who might be well-intentioned or maybe just was ignorant about something, does something that's bad, and and they might be willing to correct it. They might be open to being corrected. But the moment you label their act racist, you label them racist, they become very defensive. So there's a way that racism can sometimes work as a conversation starter when more discussion would actually be helpful. So he says, look, let's call some of these things racial wrongs that we can, talk to some folks and maybe address, and reserve racism for those really bad things. Folks like Tommy Shelby and Michael Hardiman say no. Look, it doesn't matter. We can actually address a lot of your worries, Professor Blum, but we have to conceive of racism in this more wide sense. So this is kind of the debate. There's Blum on one side, Shelby, Hardiman on the other, a lot of people in between. Should we think of the concept of racism in a wide or narrow sense? I think this is an important discussion to have. But what I actually think is happening with a lot of these pan-racial groups, I'm thinking of groups like Latin American and MENA, Middle Eastern, North African descended peoples. So groups that are composed of a variety of races that get categorized into one group, is actually something different. I think the debate there begins a little bit earlier. It begins with the concept of race and whether we should have a concept of race that's much more delimited or much more expanded. So this is when you talk about the concept of race in this way, we're asking, well, what groups properly count as racial groups? In my view, is that you could adopt either a wide or narrow concept of racism, but we should be working with a more delimited concept of race, right? I think what this will actually do, if we take that more delimited concept of race, is it'll constrain the instances that properly count as racist, irrespective of how severe we judge the moral harm to be. It'll be more limited. So why favor a delimited concept of race. After all, it actually seems that in common usage, we're trending towards expanding the concept. And I think that's right. So I'm kind of swimming upstream here in some ways. The concept of race, I think, seems to be, we're expanding it more rather than delimit it. And this is a worry. And I hope by the time I finish with this paper, I'll have made a strong and attractive enough case for why we should appeal to a more delimited concept. So in the rest of the section, what I'm going to try to explain is what I mean by this delimited concept. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons here for why we should take that instead of expanding it. But again, I'm kind of conceding that I think my view is kind of in the minority view right now. But here's one reason. We have to delimit it at some point. We can't have everything. Not every single division that we make within the human species can be a division in race. We have to delimit this at some point. And so what would a delimited definition be? So here is a modest attempt at a delimited definition of race. I think that even if I'm mistaken about this, even if my definition fails, a delimited definition of racism is going to look something like this. It's going to say something about what races are, and they're human subgroups that have been widely, and for some still are, believed to be biologically distinct from other human subgroups in something like these important following ways. Members of the same race share phenotypic traits that are or are thought to be closely correlated with both a particular region of the world and to underlying moral, intellectual, aesthetic, and athletic characteristics. Furthermore, these phenotypic traits, and their underlying characteristics are supposed to be immutable and inheritable. Now, the important thing to stress is that today most theorists and much of the general, and a good part of the general public, recognize that at least in the way just described, the way racial naturalists thought them to be real, there is no direct biological correspondence between these phenotypic traits, like skin color, and attributes like moral, intellectual, aesthetic, and athletic abilities. These phenotypes themselves could be a predictor of one's region of ancestry come from, but even that's not a great connection. So in short, human species cannot be divided in the way racial naturalists once believed it could. And most attempts to do so have tended to justify or reify policies and institutions and systems that have wronged, oppressed, and in many other ways harmed members of groups considered to be racially inferior. Now, I've got a whole section here on racial eliminativism. I am going to skip over it. I am not on the racial eliminativist side. And the reason I'm going to skip over this section is in part of this paper is seeking to address a question, not about whether we ought to do away with the concept of race. I think we can't do away with it, but whether we should expand that concept to include other groups that have traditionally not been regarded as races. Right. So one worry is going to be, look, what Mendoza, what you're advocating for, the limiting concept of race, right? What it's going to do is that there's going to be some group-based wrongs that are not going to receive the kind of moral censure they deserve without being called racist. And this wrong will not be properly called racist if the groups in question are not thought to be racist in the proper sense. And so these pan-racial groups are the ones I'm interested in, and in part because if you look at the history of the concept of race, it might seem counterintuitive to us now, but if you look at what some of these earlier folks had to say about the division of race, so going back to Francois Bernier, who was the first one to put together a new division of Earth. This is usually when people trace back the race concept, they go back to this writing by Francois Bernier. He puts people that we now consider in the Middle East squarely in the white category. So does Immanuel Kant when he breaks up his 4 races, right? He counts the Moors, the Arabs, the Turkish Tartars, and the Persians, includes them all in the white race. So does Blumenbach, does the same thing, puts these folks squarely into the white race. De Gabineau, who coined the term Aryan, the term Aryan he believed were folks who came from Serbia into India and the Middle East. In fact, he takes that term, which now when you think of Iran, for example, it's now thought of as the land of the Aryans, right? So these folks, these kind of pioneers of race and race thinking and racism, they included folks that we now in the United States at this time, we don't necessarily consider them white. They clearly considered them white. So does Madison Grant. He's got three distinctions on whiteness. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but people from the Iberian Peninsula and in the Middle East, for Madison Grant, they wouldn't have been properly white, but they would have still fallen into a sort of sub-white status there. Okay. So here's kind of my reply to this worry. This is similar to what Blum proposed when he reserved the term racism for just the most severe kinds of moral wrongs. What seems to motivate him in these other attempts is the idea that expanding the concept is that it will not receive the proper, if we don't expand the concept, or in Blum's case, delimit the concept of racism, here expand the concept of race. It will not receive the proper amount of moral opprobrium, and without which we can't call these things racist in the proper sense. But both approaches, I think, Blum's proposal to narrow the concept of racism and the call to expand the concept of race, to me, what they do is they make the severity of the harm itself, rather than the unique referent of the term, the determining factor in how we deploy terms like race and racism. And I think this thing gets things backwards. And you start to see this in sort of comical examples. I didn't include this in the slide, but if you take 2 minutes and you Google blue racism, there's like a video where it makes the argument that some of the hostility and discrimination that police officers are feeling in the current climate should be considered racism. And then they make these parallels to it. And clearly, even if you think that the kind of discrimination or hostility that the police officers face is wrong and unjust and so forth, it's misguided in the sense of thinking about that as racism, because police officers are not themselves a race. And so this is the kind of delimiting that I'm advocating for, right? One way of getting the kind of moral censure you want would be to expand the concept of race to include this particular group, such that discrimination, hostility against them counts as racism, right? But there's a reason to keep these groups out. So I'll move on to my second reason for a delimited concept. I think anti-racist remedies are designed to combat a very specific set of harms and wrongs. Now, some of these harms and wrongs that require redress today, interesting enough, predate race and racism. So if you look at Orientalism or Islamophobia, those things did not come into the scene, in the 1600s. These forms of harms and discrimination pre-existed race and racism. So presumably you could have these things exist past. If say we got rid of race and racism, that would not in and of itself deal with these sorts of harms. So if our aim is to adequately address these forms of discrimination and hostility, we shouldn't lose sight of their differences as well. So when you try to shoehorn these discriminations and hostilities into the category of racism, they might provide some short-term gains, but the worry I have is they're going to cover over or have us lose sight of, and therefore not fully address, the non-racial features and qualities of these harms and long-term discriminations. Right? So if the hostility is towards a religion or a particular culture or language, right, you can take the racial element, you can deal with some of the racial elements and still have these things exist. And then the final reason for delimiting the concept, right, to describe this kind of discrimination faced by pan-racial groups such as Latinx and MENA folks, is that they tend to cover internal forms of and specifically anti-Black racism within these groups, right? So I'm going to quickly go over this, but we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but I want to get to that second section. But I just want to say there is a let me get to the pictures and tell you the difference. So here are folks, right, who are identify, say, for example, as Muslim, but they can't be, they are of a different sort of racial group. Same thing with Latinx folks. All of these folks are Latino, Latin American, right? But one of the points I make really about internal and intra-racial hostility, right? So there's the kind of self-hatred you have. Say you belong to the Black race and you buy into all the racist propaganda, and so you become, in a sense, self-hating. That's not the kind of intra-racial discrimination that I'm talking about here, or racism. So Charlie Sheen, for example, has anti-Black hostility against David Ortiz, or anti-Indigenous hostility to Rigoberta Manchu. It's not self-hating, and it's important because it does matter. So these are some really racist depictions, anti-Black racist depictions that you find in places like Mexico. And when you confront people about this, it is not uncommon to hear people say, this is not racist. We, Mexico, we're a mestizo race. We're a mixed race. So we're not laughing at Black people, we're laughing at ourselves. So this can't be racist. Clearly, this is racist. Right? So the move of homogenizing a group can actually work to cover over internal forms of anti-Black racism, which is not self-hatred anti-Black racism, because if you think of it that way, you've kind of missed what's happening, and anti-Asian discrimination as well. So those are the three reasons I have for wanting to delimit the concept. But even if we delimit the concept, what I still haven't done, let me go back to my book, to my reading here. So let me summarize. So I think race and racism have a unique history and logic that might have derived from and at times mirrored other forms of hostility and oppression. Now, this account, I think, helps make sense of how members of non-white racial groups can or cannot be absorbed into whiteness. Well, sorry, I still haven't really explained how this is going to happen. So the one way of looking at this is looking at the issue of racialization, racial formation, and racial disaggregation. I kind of lost my track here for a second. So what I want to try to do now is explain how some of these ethnic groups can fall into whiteness, and how some racial groups that were not considered fully white, right, become ethnic groups instead. So one of the confusions with racialization and racial formation is that Michael Omni and Howard Wynett use this in their landmark book, Racial Formation in the United States. They use it synonymously. They both mean the process through which races are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. There's been a debate to try to disentangle the two, but it's been done in what I would call philosophy of language of race. So let me put these up here for you, and I'll try to explain this really quickly and get to this part here. Okay. So there is a unique issue that happens in philosophy of race, which is race was supposed to demarcate a natural kind. We now say this natural kind doesn't exist. We now say, well, race is a social construction. So you have the same term referring to two different things. Race is a natural kind, race is a social construction. And for most people, they don't care about this. But for philosophers, this presents a problem. What is the referent of the term race? What are we referring to? And so one of the things that Blum and Hochman have proposed that we do is that we reserve the term racial formation to mean races as natural kinds, and we use racialization to refer to races when we're talking about races as social construction. So this gives us a way of talking about both of these things, gives us theoretical space to say in a non-paradoxical sense that race is both materially not real, but socially very real. I'm going to propose something else. I think races have always been social constructions. And so there's an argument to be had there, which I'm going to skip over here for now. They've always been social constructions. It would actually be better if we use the term racialization to talk about the process, procedure by which a group, a practice, or a thing is marked or placed within or comes to be associated with an already existing racial group. A more simple way of thinking about this is think of races as already existing cubby holes, right? So they're the cubby holes. It's where do these things get placed? And this helps to explain a problem that comes up in philosophy of race, which is passing and traveling. So people say, how can race be socially constructed if people can pass or if race doesn't travel? Well, it's pretty easy because racialization does all this work. So someone who is racialized as Black in the United States, they travel to a place like the Dominican Republic or to Brazil. They can then be racialized in a non-Black racial category, say Moreno. It's easier for us. That's what we mean by racialization. Or we can even talk about styles of dress, food, music, manner of speaking. When these things come to be associated with an already existing racial group, that's what we mean by racialization, right? In these cases, what's important is that we're not actually bringing into existence a racial group. Those cubby holes already exist. We're simply placing someone or something, right, as being associated with this now. This is different from racial formation. Racial formation is going to be that larger process, that bigger story that we tell about how these categories came into existence and how they were maintained. So this is different from racialization. So we've got these two things now. And I submit that we ought to think about them in these two different senses. But there is still a third aspect that I think we need to consider, which is racial disaggregation. This is the process by which distinct racial groups stop functioning as racial groups. And then what typically happens is that its members get re-racialized into other groups, or right? So you can have an and/or become an ethnic group. And so here I have in mind folks like the Irish, Italians, Polish. So there's these books you'll find, how did the Irish become white and so forth. It was very common, even just 100 years ago, to think of what we now think of as monolithic white race as being divided into at least two, if not more, distinct races. So there's always kind of the Anglo and the Latin. But if you look at people like Madison Grant that I showed you earlier in the slides, right, you could have the Nordic race, that was a real white race, and then there was the kind of the Alpine and the Mediterranean races and so forth. Well, all these groups, right, all these different kinds of groups, of white groups, experience a kind of form of racial disaggregation. And you get a kind of melting pot. Now, this helps understand what happens with these groups and why the melting pot works for these groups, but doesn't work for other groups. Other groups have accepted the hyphenated terms. They've become, African American, Native American, Asian American, but the hyphen doesn't work for these groups, because for these groups, what's happening is something different. They are racial groups. They're racial groups the racial groups have not undergone racial disaggregation and probably will not be able to undergo racial disaggregation. So in the final section here, I want to say what I'm thinking about with racism and race, as I described in the first section, along with the way I'm encouraging you to think about racialization, racial formation, racial segregation, what this has to say for the kind of discrimination, hostility, and oppression faced by pan-racial groups, such as Latin Americans and MENA-descended peoples in the US today. So in this next section, this next and final section, I want to say a little bit more about the difference between xenophobia and racism. And you can't talk about xenophobia and racism in philosophy without consulting the work of Ron Sundstrom and David Kim. They make this excellent point about the difference between xenophobia and racism, and I'm going to focus just on one passage, which is very helpful. So they conclude a section with this passage, which I think encapsulates a lot of their thought. They say, look, civic outsiders, right? So the difference between a civic outsider and a racial outsider is important in their work. Civic outsiders are not necessarily racial outsiders, although most racial outsiders were deemed ipso facto to be civic outsiders. The convergence does not hold up. In the United States, for example, Native Americans and African Americans were explicitly not included in the nation. Over time, however, those groups, among others, were granted, even under paternalistic and dominating conditions, a degree of, and this is what's important for them, is not racial insider status, right, but civic insider status. This insider status was, of course, limited, exploitative, and degrading. We do not mean to make too much of the civic insider status, but to be inside is not to be outside. So there is clearly racism for them, but there's also a kind of xenophobia which we need to appreciate. Now, this is admittedly easier said than done, given that the two seem to come as a package deal, racism and xenophobia. And the most obvious group for which this comes to, and I thought sort of missing here in Sundstrom and Kim's quote, is Asian Americans. Asian Americans were clearly missing in their quote, and this is clearly a group for whom racism and xenophobia have tended to come together. but what I want to sort of argue is that the combination of racism and xenophobia, as entwined as we see with Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, could probably be more the exception than the actual rule. And we see this now. I'm going to show you this is 10 years old now, but it's still important to look at the census. I'm showing you this not because I think the census is the last and final word on this, but I think it captures some of the intuitions we have about the difference between an ethnicity and a race, and how we would think of. There's a proposal to put a MENA box, a Middle Eastern, North African box as well in the census. But notice question one. Question one asks you about your ethnicity. So there it asks you, right, what kind of Latinx, what kind of Latino, Hispanic are you? It's not till you get to question 6 that we start talking about race. And there, when you get to the quote unquote Asian category, there you have to, your race is already assumed, but then you have to tell us what kind of ethnicity or nationality are you? And so the question would be, what do you do with a pan-Asian, with a pan-racial group, such as MENA? But what I'm going to focus on, just for the sake of keeping this simple, I think it's going to expand. It could expand to the MENA group as well. Is I'm just going to look at the debate about Latinx identity. So within the philosophical debates about Latinx identity, most folks have, not all, but a lot have come to the conclusion that Latinx identity should be seen as a kind of ethnicity. Jorge Gracia's work on this is sort of the principal work. He gives a family historical view. I'm not going to read the quote, but the quote, it just basically says, 1492, something happened there that was, a world important event, such that it created a new people. And so his account of Latinx is much more expansive. He includes not just people in Latin America and the Caribbean, but Latin America, the Caribbean, and the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. Ernesto Rosen Velasquez argues for a common bundle view. He suggests that what a real Latinx identity is one that just has enough of these cultural elements. So you don't have to have this deep connection the way that Gracia talks about. He just says you can have things like speaking Spanish, being named Juan, using Sason, and so forth. So this is these are the two views that people have put forth to think of Latinx as a kind of ethnic identity. What I want to do now is give you a very quick, rough and ready history of xenophobia and differentiate a little bit more with racism. Xenophobia in the United States has its roots in the kind of discrimination faced by German immigrants in the early 1700s. So before you had Donald Trump, you actually had Benjamin Franklin, who was really concerned with the dramatic increase in German immigration in the 1750s. And he asked famously, why should Pennsylvania, founded by English, become a colony of aliens? The reason Franklin was so opposed to German immigration was that instead of assimilating, he saw these immigrants as herding together and establishing their languages and manners to the exclusion of ours. Not to mention, he thought that Germany was clearly not sending us their best and their brightest, only their most ignorant, stupid, those not used to liberty, and those who would soon outnumber us. 100 years later, the Germans became accepted as part of American whiteness, and this xenophobia was then transferred onto Irish Catholics, Irish Italians. I want to go quickly through these pictures, but what I want you to see is the way these folks are depicted. So you know this is an Irish person because he's got the top hat, the shillelagh, the pipe, and as a Catholic, they have gutted and are giving to the Pope the Democratic Party. This idea that the Irish are coming to, but notice the kinds of features they give the Irish tend to be the same kind of stereotypical degrading features that they would have used to depict Black folks at the same time. Right. The same thing with Italians. These are all Italians coming over, all their badness. But these folks eventually get accepted into the melting pot, as I mentioned before. Racism in the United States has a much different origin story than xenophobia. Again, I'm not saying it doesn't come together sometimes, right? Clearly it does, but they intertwine, but they're distinct enough. It's a story grounded in our continent. That's what the key for me here. It's not just in the United States, it's continent wide. Okay, I'm doing okay. When you look at like the slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, you know, something like 90% of the African slaves brought to the Western Hemisphere ended up, you know, south of the Rio Grande in the Caribbean and in Latin America and South America, right? So it's a story grounded in our continent-wide history of settler colonialism, chattel slavery, and unlike the victims of xenophobia, who eventually, some of them got eventually welcomed to whiteness once their eligibility for citizenship was no longer in question, the victims of racism have throughout the Americas, let me just put these out here, have throughout the Americas remained at the bottom of the well. The U.S. is no exception here. Even after acquiring formal citizenship and embracing hyphenated identities, Native American, African American, Asian American, they've found no room for themselves in the melting pot. The U.S. can be a nation of immigrants, in quotes, but it will never be a non-white nation. Understanding the difference between groups forged under conditions of xenophobia and those forged under racism helps us understand what is at the core of these pan-racial groups and why they break apart in the ways that they do. A Latinx identity is never more real than when it's confronting xenophobic concerns. The worries that unite nearly all Latinx people, whether Cuban, Puerto Rican, Mexican, Central American, and so forth, similar to the Germans in the 1700s and the Irish Catholics of the 1880s, when they are targeted for their language, their culture, and are portrayed as somehow as a threat to the American way of life. This is the common bundle. Nowhere are you going to find a stronger sense of Latinidad. Where things begin to fall apart, however, is when we're forced to deal with issues of race and racism. Here we see how racism has been, again, a continent-wide as opposed to merely a national project. White Cubans and white Colombians do not suddenly stop being white simply because they are victims of xenophobia. They do not suddenly forget what whiteness is and the privileges that come with it. Similarly, Black Latinx in Georgia do not stop being Black simply because they also happen to be targets of xenophobia. Nor Latinx, and especially indigenous Latinx in the American Southwest, who have historically been victims of U.S. manifest destiny, confused about the differences between those coming into their territory as settler colonialists on the one hand, and migrants fleeing violence and starvation on the other. In short, while the case of Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, in that case, we tend to see racism and xenophobia as closely linked, this inseparability seems to be more the exception than the historical norm. We should therefore keep these two things distinct, and instead of expanding our concept of racism to get at the moral censure that we want or think that these kinds of discrimination and oppressions deserve, I think what we ought to do is increase the moral censure we attribute to things like xenophobia. So to conclude here, and I'll leave these up here, so kind of the worries and my responses, maybe they weren't, my responses weren't accurate, but I think the worries are nonetheless interesting to think about. So I'm just going to read my conclusion here. It's only a paragraph. To conclude, I believe that an investigation into pro-white nationalist comments, such as those made by Donald Trump, show us not that the concept of race needs expansion, but that our notion of American whiteness might need to be rethought so as to allow it to be seen as more than just a racial project. It should first and foremost be seen as a pernicious nation-building and nation-maintaining project, a project that is often coextensive with racial projects, as we see in the history of anti-miscegenation, sterilization, segregation, and anti-immigration laws aimed at eradicating or removing non-white races, or in places like Latin America, where you actually get a pro-immigration stances as a way of whitening the country stock. But also along with these racial objectives, American whiteness has continued the practice of removing or keeping out non-Western elements. This second move also merits, I think, moral censure, even when such moves manage to avoid the charge of racism. The worry, as I see it, is that the second kind of discrimination will not receive strong obviously strong nor the right kind of moral censure if it's not recognized as racism proper. But I hope to have said enough to convince people that this is not necessarily a reason to expand the concept of race, but perhaps to more strongly condemn other forms of discrimination. In a world where we take nation states to be sacred, as we do, tend to be seen as just regrettable, but not morally wrong or unjust. My proposal, I believe, will help us rather than hinder us in uncovering problematic forms of discrimination, and will actually do a better job of identifying the wrong-making features of discrimination that would merely then would help us to find these features rather than merely expanding or reconceptualizing the way we think of racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mendoza, for your presentation. We're going to go ahead and start the Q&A session. If you are a member of the GSU community, so if you're a GSU student, faculty, or community member, when you insert your question into the chat, please state which one you are. Once you do so, if your question is chosen, then I will give you microphone and video rights so you can ask your question. Because this is a Phi Sigma Tau sponsored speaker, we will be prioritizing student questions first. Okay. The first question is from Wendy Zhao. She says, thanks so much for the great talk. I wonder how we can distinguish xenophobia, and racism, thinking that comparatively xenophobia of fears for Chinese virus is more politicized for replications to justify their counteractions against Chinese government. And she says, when referring to racism, she meant anti-Asian racism.
That's a great question, and maybe we can get like a follow-up. What's interesting to me is in places like Mexico, that's actually what a lot of folks there have done is they use xenophobia to talk about that kind of racism, and I don't know. I guess it'll be context dependent. And as I said, Wendy, if you could follow if I'm missing the point. To some extent, it would be context dependent. There, it's more important to use something like xenophobia, because anytime you charge folks with racism, the move in Mexico is, well, we're a mestizo race, we're a mixed race, so we can't be racist, right? And so you are actually able to say, well, okay, we'll go with the xenophobia, which is more of ethnic discrimination, and that you can't deny, right? You're putting down these kinds of cultures, this kind of language. And people forget there is a very significant Asian population in places like Mexico. Two things we'll forget is that there's a significant Asian population throughout Latin America, because once you had the exclusions on the West Coast, a lot of Asian immigrants ended up in places throughout Latin America. Peru, for example, as you saw with Alberto Fujimori, has a very large a significant Japanese descendant population. And so if I got your question right, well, how to sort of so I think that could be right. Here I might be speaking against myself. I think in the context of the United States, I think it's important to stress the racism given the history. But I do think the anti-Asian sentiment is tricky because the two of them come together, and I think here it's much harder to separate the xenophobia and the racism. But I do think it's context dependent, and some of it's practical. So the answer I gave you for Mexico, I was thinking I would think about that as an activist. If I'm an activist in Mexico, and I want to protect these sorts of this group of people, or make sure their rights are defended, or highlight the kind of hostility and discrimination that they're undergoing, I might use a term like xenophobia, as opposed to racism.
I'm just going to go ahead and allow Wendy to follow up.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Wendy. Thank you for your question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you for the great talk. Yeah, I think it's so important to distinguish between xenophobia and racism. I'm still thinking about it because I'm taking a sociology class about critical race theory. So I would like to study how the Asian Americans using hashtag like Stop Asian Hate as part of the counter storytelling. So yeah, part of the paper is try to disentangle the historical roots of racism. So I was struggling about like how to distinguish between xenophobia, racism, and yeah, and all those like anti foreigner sentiments. So I think your point is correct that we have to like put all this analysis in different contexts. So I'm still thinking about this. So thank you for like all the suggestions and the great definitions.
Thank you.
Dr. Mendoza, did you want to follow up on that? Was there anything else you had to add?
Oh, yeah, I think let's move on to the next one. But I think that's right. And it's a very good point that Wendy raises. Very helpful.
Okay. Next question is from Sherry Mazoud. He asks, as someone mostly unfamiliar with the philosophical literature on race, I was wondering if you could say more about how your conception of race compares to other conceptions. You mentioned you have a minority view. What is the more dominant view? Does it turn on your view of race always being socially constructed?
It's a great question. So I should say it's more of a minority. When I said that, I should have been clear that I think that it's a minority view in the general public. I think people have, when the folk users of the term race, I think I've been expanding the concept of race. There is an unlimited amount of definitions in philosophy. And so that's why I was very cagey about giving a definition. I was trying to get a definition that I think would include the minimum of what most people include when they define race. Now, what turns on something being socially constructed is so I'm on the socially constructed team. What happens is we get certain objections raised against us. One is, well, look, if race is socially constructed, and how do you have a phenomenon like passing? Because isn't that what race just is? Isn't it that you're just passing? And, why is it that race can't travel? And so what I think the other concepts I'm using, racialization, racial formation, racial disaggregation, show you how contextualized the concept of race actually is. And so some of these other objections that people have raised against the social constructed nature of race, I think my way of dividing racialization, racial formation, and racial disaggregation does a better job of accounting for these things. Then you can be a social constructivist about race, and the phenomenon of passing and the phenomenon of race not traveling get addressed. I don't know if we can do the same thing, but maybe you can bring Sherry in and see if I totally missed the point, which I tend to do.
Hey, Sherry here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Sherry. Yes. Okay,
great. No, yeah, that pretty much covered what I was wondering. When you said, race has always been socially constructed, I took it to be, that's a claim that would need a lot of unpacking and stuff like that. And I didn't want you to, spend way too much time on it, but that definitely helped a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I am very, so so this is what people like Larry Blum feel like they have to somehow deal with. Like, well, this thing is always, they thought they were picking out like this real natural kind. And that's how that term is used. Like, how do I have a conversation with Kant? Because, he's using it this way and we're using it this way. And I just kind of say, look, they maybe they thought they were pointing to that, but they were always pointing to a social construction. And that allows me the wiggle room to use these other terms, in a different way. Yeah, yes, Juan. Sure. Juan, jump in. Can we get Juan in here? My buddy. Juan, how are you? Good to hear you or kind of see you. Well, maybe not.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
I can hear you now. How are you?
Okay.
I can hear you.
Great to see you, brother. Sorry, I don't want to jump in if there's other students who want to ask questions, because I can also follow up after. My question was pretty narrow, Jose.
Oh, I'm sorry, but yeah, I took Sabrina's job. Sorry, I tend to do that.
No, Sabrina, is this okay? Apologies.
No, you're good. Go ahead, Dr. Glasscock.
Okay, thank you.
I apologize to other people too. This is my buddy, and I saw his name on the list, so I was like, yeah.
Yeah, great to see you. I'm really excited to be able to make your talk. That was super interesting as usual. I just had a kind of a narrow question about, so I was pretty moved initially about the concern that moved me most about why we shouldn't have a really broad concept of race was that it's going to lead us to misidentify cases of self-hating. And so your example, one of your examples was of Charlie Sheen, for instance, throwing shade against, let's say, Black Latin folks and still counting that as self-hating. And I'm with you, like that's just a miscategorization. And then I was thinking whether, I mean, it might just be kind of a notational difference in the end then once you have this kind of view on the table, but whether somebody who goes for the broad view of race might nonetheless say something like this. Well, it's a broad view in that all of these people are indeed going to count as, let's say, Latins or Hispanics. But in order to count as self-hating, you need to, as it were, share in all the species of that group. And the reason then that Charlie Sheen doesn't count as self-hating is because he's not of the same, if we are using kind of the genus-species model, he shares in the genus, but not the species of the race of the people that he hates on.
I think that's, that's exactly right. That's one bullet they would have to bite. And I think what I would say to them is, I think then you end up with things like, well, who's the real Latinx? I think, right? I think that'd be one. You could go that route, but I think it would just create more problems for that particular position, because then we have to like start checking people's like Latinx card, like well, yeah, it's Charlie Sheen, but is he really Latinx? Another route you can do, if you're going to expand it and say, well, Latinx is a race, is to say, well, Charlie Sheen is self-hating. But I think I already got you on board that might be too much. But I think some folks would rather bite that bullet. They'd rather say no. Charlie Sheen just is a self. Not I have no clue what he thinks. He's probably a very nice progressive guy. I don't know him. I put him on there because he's actually, if you guys don't know, his real name is Carlos Estevez. Right. So anyway, but So Juan, to quickly answer your question, and if you want to do a quick follow-up, I think they could go that route, but I feel like it's just going to create more problems for folks who want to take that route, because then at one point, then you actually weirdly start narrowing the concept of Latinx, right? It's only the Latinx who listen to the right kind of ranchera music, do these sorts of things, or committed to these sorts of things that are the real Latinx. Or did I misunderstand you?
No, you understood me, and I'm fully on board with you. Sorry, I was laughing at the only those who listen to rancheras are gonna count as Latinx.
If and only if.
Yeah. I guess so. I definitely don't want. I do think that would be a bad bullet to bite if they end up saying, yeah, that counts as self-hating. That seems to kind of, the concept is not doing what it's supposed to do. But I guess I'm not sure that I think, especially if you're thinking of it in terms of the genus-species model, if it gives rise to these worries about who's the real Latinx, it would be kind of, on that model, it would be like saying like, who's the real animal, the dog or the horse? Well, they're all of them equal animals, but maybe kind of like, we don't count it as like, let's say, I don't know which animal, I guess lions, eat other lions, so they count as cannibalistic, but not if they eat, zebras, even though they're the same animals. We can follow up later. I don't want to take a time, but definitely, I agree with you that once we start counting the case of Charlie Sheen as self-hating, that has stretched out the concept far too wide, and that's definitely a good reason to go with the more narrow view.
Thank you, Juan.
Thanks.
Okay. The Q&A chat is still open, so if you still have questions, please continue to submit them. The next speaker will be Isaac.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. This is really interesting stuff. I hope you can hear me. If there's any issues, just please let me know. So my question is about sort of debates regarding the abolition of social categories. Specifically, sometimes in this work, folks will argue that really the end goal when we're theorizing about something like race or, oftentimes gender, is that these are socially constructed categories which really ought to be abolished just because they're, so often used to oppress people. And, I myself am not necessarily a proponent of that, but I do wonder sort of what your thoughts on that would be and where you think your project fits in. So is that, a goal that's possible or worthwhile? And if so, do you think that, your proposed definition of race helps work towards that goal? Or if not, what is the relationship, would you say, between your definition and, a project of abolition?
That's a great question, Isaac. Thank you. I think it's almost like a plant. I skipped over this huge section on racial eliminativism, and just jump in whenever you have a question. So I'm going to say some things, and you just jump in and say, "Well, this is what I mean," or no, you misheard me. To begin with, I tried to present a position that be kind of neutral, but I am not on the side of racial eliminativism, and that's because I think things are. So there's different. When you think of like the existence of things very simplistically, right? There's things like I'm here in Seattle and out my window I can see Mount Rainier, right? Like that's a very real natural kind. Like we didn't socially construct that. But this apartment building is not really natural, but it's got existence. Like someone actually built this thing, right? And then there's things like money, which requires some faith in us to have for it to continue to exist, but it's very real. And then there's a last thing, which is like werewolves. So there's, I'm sure there was a time where people believed there's such thing as werewolves. And all you had to do was just get the knowledge, like werewolves don't exist. And boom, that fear, that, dread that you had is gone. And sometimes people think of races as werewolves, and sometimes they think of them as Mount Rainier. And those two ways of thinking about race, to me, seem completely mistaken. Race is probably somewhere closer to money, perhaps like the building I'm in. But here's the difference between there's four ways of thinking about race. So there's the natural race, which I think is just false. There's the just straight up illusion of race, like races like werewolves, where we can if we just got the right information, we would stop believing in it. I think it's closer to a social construction in the way that money is a social construction. It clearly requires us to participate in it, but it's hard because it's almost like we have no choice. I can't just pretend. I can't just be like, well, money's fake, right, and not pay my rent. So I think I think race is closer to that. And so the view I'm proposing, Isaac, is how do we deal with a world where we're going to have race socially constructed like money for the foreseeable future? I'll let you jump in if something I said didn't make any sense, which might have been all of it.
No, I think that all made a lot of sense, and I appreciate the response. I think that I would tend to agree, and I also, at least my intuition would be that your account can sort of, stay neutral on the issue if it needs to. I mean, that's sort of partially why I was curious about it, but yeah, no, I think that that's definitely a great answer, and that it's something you could say to someone who does want it as the end goal, I presume, because some people also might, money is a good example. Some people might also say that's also one of the things that we should abolish if you're, say, a Marxist, for instance. And so I guess the only sort of follow up I would have at that point would be, even over a long range, would it be possible and desirable, to work towards the abolition of this sort of social category?
Oh, okay. Yes, right. That's the second part. That's right. Great question. And let me quickly say, for folks who were listening, we're kind of, why did I say a building and money, and I didn't explain that? A building has a kind of material reality. So there are some folks in literature who talk about race as socially constructed, but having a material reality, so like a building. Money, even though we have bills, right, it's actually more like an idea, it's ideational. So other folks say race is socially constructed, but it's more of an idea, and I tend to fall more in line with those folks. So anyway, just to go back to that point. Isaac, I think more along the lines of, could we get rid of racism? And so that is a possibility. So if it were impossible, then we wouldn't be anti-racist, right? In order for us to be truly anti-racist, we have to believe that we can defeat racism. And then once you defeat racism, then the question is, well, what work are the races doing? And for some folks, Isaac, if you are a materialist in this sense, like you think it's a building, you think, look, we get rid of the idea of racism, but we have changed the material world in such a way that it's still helpful to think about races. So, you know, folks who might, you know, of a particular race might be prone to suffer from certain kinds of medical issues and so forth. So it's got a very material, it's got a real material reality that even if we get rid of racism, it continues to exist. And so I think you're right to point out that I think if I tend to focus more on the ideational, like, you know, ideology, racism, race, then by the time you get rid of racism, races really aren't doing that much work. So it'll disappear the way you said money work. But what I'm more interested in is, even if we get to that point, we got rid of racism, what I worry about is these other forms of discrimination that have a similar logic to race and racism, that are still harmful, morally unjust, that we can classify right now as xenophobic. And I want to have tools to be able to still identify those things and be able to attack those things, and not make us just, well, we can pat ourselves on the back if we got rid of racism. We can pat ourselves really big on the back, but then we'd still have these other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Sorry, I only just realized you can't see me nodding, but I am nodding, and yes, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that it's a great answer. So yeah, I appreciate it, and thanks again.
Okay. Anonymous attendee asked, what are your thoughts, feelings, opinions on the Hillary/Baldwin debacle? That is, if you're familiar with it.
Oh man, I'm going to expose myself. I don't know what this is. Am I really an idiot for not knowing? I don't know what that is. I don't
know what that is either. I actually wanted to ask you a question, if it's okay with it.
Please, yes.
So something I've been seeing on social media, particularly Twitter, has been that the hashtags like Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, they haven't been as effective because they're putting the emphasis or the responsibility on the wrong people, if that makes sense. And so some people are suggesting that maybe we should just have a hashtag that says Stop White Supremacy. And I was kind of wondering what your opinion on this was.
I don't, it's going to make people uncomfortable to have a hashtag like, and white supremacy, but that's the hashtag that this talk is weirdly, even though I'm making these distinctions, you're absolutely, you put your finger right at the right place. Even though I'm making all these distinctions, ultimately what I'm saying is white supremacy is the thing we have to go after, right? That's racism is being used. Why? What it's trying to do? It's trying to promote white supremacy. When xenophobia gets used, what's it doing? It's promoting white supremacy. I think that's true. And I don't know if this was part of your question, so I tend to do this. I answer a question by asking the person who asked me a question that they don't have to answer. But I did like seeing the two together, Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate, because of the fact that one very reasonable reaction when things like this happen is to say, well, we need more law enforcement to protect our communities. And that's not unreasonable. But what tends to happen when you increase law enforcement is that tends to disproportionately fall on Black folks, right? It tends to burden them. And so then you start pitting racial minority groups against each other. And I think, as you said, I think what we need is a more united front. And so So maybe, yeah, maybe when you suggest, and I don't know how to get these things to trend, but if I could magically make them trend. So anyway, I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think that's very spot on. Just based on what happened, I believe last fall with the election, and how there was a lot of emphasis, at least in Atlanta, with getting Black people to vote, when in reality, Black people were only maybe they were not the biggest percentage of voters that weren't voting Democrat. And the fact that there were actually a lot of moderates that could have been reached out to. And so the fact that they targeted the Black people rather than like the larger population was sort of what stood out to me, what reminded me of this situation.
That's a good point.
Dr. Cohen says he has a question.
Thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the exchange that you had with Isaac, where you were talking about race being a type of social construction. And I wanted to invite you to elaborate a little bit more on that, and in particular about the corrigibility of statements about race and what sorts of things might correct those sorts of judgments, where it is that people can go wrong. Because one of the points that you were mentioning in your presentation is how these sorts of things can be context sensitive. So thinking about the analogy that you were drawing to money, which I recognize there are some potential disanalogies to it, but just pushing on that a little bit, there's a certain respect in which somebody can get money wrong, where somebody can just not understand how it is that a particular item of currency, a physical item, might have a certain value. And I wonder if something similar might go on, and how it is that it might go on when somebody were to make a judgment about racial membership or the relative significance of racial membership in a particular social context. So can people get this wrong? Or, and what is the sort of thing that are defeaters of statements about race, racial membership, or racial values? Thanks for your thoughts on that.
Oh, stay on, so don't go away too far. Because I mean, this is great. This is a paper on itself, and folks will have different things to say. You're right. So what's interesting about these things, these kinds of social constructions, is exactly what you said. People can get them wrong, and you think, well, if they're socially constructed, how can we all kind of get them wrong? Or why is so? For example, in the United States, we have this phenomenon of passing, because in the United States, it's written down in some places, but it's not explicitly said there is a one-drop rule, and we will all adhere to it, and so forth. But we've all been adhering to the one-drop rule in the United States, which says if you have one great grandparent who's Black, you become Black. What's fascinating is in place in Latin America, you have the opposite. They had a project called blanqueamiento. So they didn't take a Darwinian approach to eugenics. They took a Lamarckian view on eugenics. So they adopted a view for almost 100 years that said we can whiten our population. You can actually get the good white qualities from your parents and other folks. You can pass these things on in this kind of Lamarckian sense. And they have these interesting murals. If you look them up, they're called blanqueamiento murals. And typically what happens is you have a Black grandmother, and she's usually thanking God. And you have, her daughter, who is morena, so she's mixed, half Black, half white, marries a white man, and they have a white baby. And so she's thanking God for the white baby because she's been able to whiten her family. So these things don't just die. You have these kinds of ideas of what race is, and they come into conflict sometimes in places like the United States. So you come to the United States and you think, well, in this part of Latin America, I'm white, and you come to the United States and you find out that you're Black. So you can be wrong. But what's interesting about this is a lot of this is the social interaction, how people talk to you and what they do. So you might be passing as white, not even know that you're passing. Sometimes you think you're passing as something that you have to be cognizant of, like, oh, I know because of the one-drop rule I'm Black, and in this context I'm passing. But you could potentially be passing in a place like the United States without even knowing that you're passing. So you're getting it wrong without knowing that you're getting it wrong. So you have to learn the racial rules. So I don't even think I'm getting close to answering your question, but just showing you how complicated this thing can be. I think I lost the thread too somewhere.
That's very helpful. I'm grateful for that. So Plessy from the Supreme Court case was
be white in Latin.
He'd be white in Latin America, but Plessy was black. But as I understood it, Plessy was part of a group of persons who wanted to be legally identified as white. I think that was part of what was going on with that, because the test case, I might be misremembering the history, but if I recall correctly, Plessy as 1/8 black was part of a group of successful persons who were not, forgive me, they were not fully, as it were, black, but they had white blood and black blood, and they were trying to identify themselves as white, but it didn't work because of, at that time, because of what the Supreme Court was doing, because Plessy was then adjudged to be black at the time.
That makes sense. That makes sense to me. I and I don't know where I got this, but I think I might have just been like my bad high school history class. But what I thought I remembered was that it was supposed to be like a shock factor. So he was 1/8 black, but he could easily pass as white, and so it was supposed to be this shocking moment because the conductor was in on it too, or whoever, the ticket person or whatever, they were all in on it. And so it's supposed to be the shocking moment where they pull up this person and go, "You're black, you can't be here." And people were supposed to be like, "But he looks just like us." But that could have just been the fairy tale story I got told in high school. I think your story makes more sense. But that's right. I mean, these are the, and yet if you were in Latin America, Latin America also had a casta system. So some of these castas would be close to 200 categories. And what I try to explain to my students is they don't think of these as mixed. We would all say, well, it's just mixed race folks. No, these were 200 different races. They had this thing like down to a science. Like if your dad was black, your mom was white, you were a mulatto. If your mom was, and the gender matter too. If your mom was Native American, but your dad was Moreno, well, then you were a Lobo. And they came up with all these, they're fascinating. They still have them. They're called castas. And there's these long lists of where you fall in certain parts of Latin America on race. Now, they got rid of that when they went to the blancamiento. And then what we have now in Latin America is a project of mestizaje, which is the idea that we're all one race. We are it comes from this philosopher, Jose Vasconcelos, who said actually what's happening in Latin America is you have the cosmic race. All four races have come together. All four races of the world have come together in Latin America. And unlike those Anglos in the north, we Latins were smart enough to mix our races and create this cosmic race called the mestizo. So someone smarter than me is going to have all the rules that you can and can't break. But there are two kinds of rules, I think, Andrew, and one of them is the kind that we're talking about. But there's also kind of this like Wittgensteinian rule too that gets confusing when you say, make it really simple. You can't say that race is a delicious chocolate sauce. Like you've just misunderstood what the concept is there, right? There's this kind of like, well, you've got some linguistic confusion that we need some Wittgenstein to come in to get the fly out of the bottle. And there's some of that happens too in a different sense, but I do think there's some real serious philosophical disagreements that happen. So does that make sense? There's two kinds of ways of getting it wrong. There's kind of the semantic way of getting it wrong, and when I'm focusing on these conceptual issues and how you can get it conceptually wrong as well. And both are, and the problem is a lot of the time the two of the semantic and the conceptual kind of confusions kind of blend into each other, and then we make normative statements where we say, well, this is what race is. So you get this a lot. I'll give you a different example, just so it's a little bit clearer. You often will hear like Marxists arguing with each other and be like, no, that's not real socialism. This is real socialism. No, this is real socialism. And what they actually are, they're not giving you a definition. They're not describing the world. They're actually giving you a normative claim. And this is how you ought to think about socialism. And I think a lot of the times, and I try to be clear when I'm doing it, a lot of times we're giving you normative definitions of race. So we might not be saying this is how race actually is, even though that's how we present it. We're actually thinking you ought to think of race in these ways. Even if they break the conceptual rule, it's still consistent with the Tinker rule. Sorry, okay. I think I've lost folks now.
No, thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay. Anonymous from earlier actually clarified their question. Hilaria Baldwin isn't a philosopher. She's white and married to Alec Baldwin, the actor. I believe he's been on Capital One commercials, but has adopted the Spanish version of her name publicly and professionally, has given the Spanish surnames to her children, speaks Spanish fluently, and sort of passed herself off as being Spanish. I'm assuming that means she was never Spanish. What are your thoughts on this?
That's interesting. Well, I'll let the Spanish speak for themselves. Maybe she is she's part of the Spanish nation, but if Juan's still around. So Juan, this is someone whose Latinx card I would take away. I would not give her the Latinx card. But this does raise interesting issues, because on Jorge Gracia's account, which pretty much I showed folks two accounts of what counts as Latinx ethnicity. On Jorge Gracia's account, this person probably would not count as Latinx, because you have to have this historical connection. But interestingly enough, I think this person would count under the common bundle view, which Ernesto Rosen Velasquez advocates. So there's no definitive answer to this one. My answer would probably be no. Yeah, my answer would probably be this person doesn't count as Latinx. Don't push me on saying why.
Okay, this will be our last question from today. You talked about, oops, sorry about that. You talked about having a Latinx card, and I know people talk about having a Black card and having it be revoked. In terms, I'm thinking about the Tommy Shelby piece and solidarity, but to what extent do you think that having those sort of cards is actually helpful for unifying a certain race or ethnic group?
Ooh, that's a good one. So how do I think it's helpful? Because usually there's the harm of it is pretty clear. I think it tends to be more harmful than helpful if it's going to be. And well, this wasn't your question, right? This was one you read. If that person wants to jump in, let's see if they follow. I think if it's helpful in the addressing the free rider worry, which is rarely. I don't know what it says about my makeup. I'm rarely worried about the free rider. I'm usually more worried about folks being left out of things than I am about someone getting a free ride. But I do think it's natural for people to worry about the free rider problem. And so you get a kind of free rider problem, which is that you get all these folks who have been part of the struggle, who have faced discrimination and undergone all these things. And then someone just discovers, like, oh, hey, by the way, like, I've got this, like, Spanish surname. Cool. Like, hire me, and, like, I'll be your diversity person, and, like, so forth. And they get the benefit both from, like, having always had white privilege, and at the same time, they get to benefit from the things that we put in place to redress xenophobia, racism, and so forth. And so they get the double dip. And so one of the advantages of having a card and pulling people's cards, someone could say, is you get to neutralize that a little bit, and then potentially, this is not exactly what I'm trying. I thought this was a very good question, so I'm not answering off the cuff. Then I think you can say, look, if we have these cards that we can take and pull, then there's more buy-in. Then you feel like, okay, well, I'll buy into this identity because then I know that, like, there's not going to be these free riders, and so whatever commitment, sacrifice I have to make, is going to pay off for all of us, and you don't have these free riders. But I think I might have just totally missed that question too.
No, I really appreciate the response. I actually have a follow-up. I guess my concern with the free rider worry is that isn't that the point, that we do want people to be able to have both privileges? And it feels in some ways that we're sort of, I guess, it seems that we're upset that other people are doing better than us. Is that, am I misunderstanding what you're saying?
You're not wrong about this. I think this is sometimes this is so two things. One thing more general. I think when we talk about white privilege, often it's not like an extra goodie or a perk. It's the fact that certain people just get treated like persons and other people are just abused. And so we call it privilege. And it's like, it shouldn't be a privilege to just be treated like a human being and have your human rights respected and that sort of thing. That shouldn't be a privilege. But in this context, we talk about it as though it is. And so that's right. But it shouldn't be a lot of these things. A lot of the things that people ask for are not actually privileges. They're not perks. They're just like, I just want my human rights respected. And so in some sense, that's exactly true. We just want to have that. In the other respect, it's not so much the being treated equal as in getting redress is, I think, the where the pressure is going to be, where we put the pressure on. It's going to be the issue that some folks deserve redress for things that have happened to them, and we have certain mechanisms to help folks who have, historically been oppressed and discriminated to redress that harm. And so the worry is going to be that, well, if we just let all these folks into our club, we're going to be letting folks who don't need this redress, who've already had their sort of human rights stuff developed. And so it's just going to be like it won't just get them back to a neutral playing field. It'll actually give them a leg up. And if we're part of this group and we've already kind of been behind, then it's going to be sort of like members of the same group who have been getting ahead and privileged just found a new way of staying ahead of us and more privileged. So, people who have faced discrimination, racially look less white and so forth, they go for a job, they're going to lose out to like white Latinx or something like that is the worry. Is it like now it's like, oh, okay, well, no matter what, we get to check the Latinx box. So let's get the person we really wanted opposed to that person. I don't know if that makes sense.
The clarification definitely made sense. And yes, it was very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation in general and for your Q&A session. It was very informative. And
my pleasure. Thank you. This was very nice. We're all very nice people. Thank you all.
We're glad to hear that. Before I end this speaker talk, I just want to plug in the rest of the Spring 2021 Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics Speaker Series speakers. As Dr. Cohen said earlier, we have a speaker next Tuesday, March 31st from 2:15 to 3:15 p.m. speaking on the meaning of life. We also have a speaker on April 1st from 3 o'clock to 4:15 p.m. who is speaking on the wrong of stalking. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mendoza, and I hope everyone else has a good weekend. Goodbye.
My pleasure. Go to those talks. Elizabeth Brake is an awesome speaker, by the way. Plugging that in, paying it forward in a way. Thank you all. Had a great time. Thank you.